So in After Effects, this is kind of the bread and butter of what it can do. It is very capable in terms of being able to deliver on this. But I think animation, when you think of animation in After Effects, you might think of it in very simplistic terms, and the truth of the matter is that it is considerably more complicated than that. So we'll start off with some questions from last week. We have a special guest this week, so as some of you might have heard when Mike was in here earlier, we have somebody that will be observing me teaching you tonight, and then at the break time around 8 o'clock, he's going to ask you some questions and give you a survey to fill out. And then you can give me your unvarnished opinion, which I will hear about. And then he'll take off, and then we'll get back to the rest of the material for the evening. We're going to be talking about keyframes. So we'll go into some detail about keyframes, because a lot of motion graphics relies on some of the techniques that we'll talk about tonight, and some of the features that are in After Effects that you don't get access to when you animate in Premiere, or pretty much in Premiere. So that includes talking about interpolation types, graph editor, and keyframe velocities. We will also, what's not on this list here is that towards the end, before we jump into the in-class activity, but after we talk through this stuff, I'm going to talk about what's on the midterm, because and you can love me or hate me for this, there is a midterm exam that is due the Monday before we get back. So you have this week and ostensibly next week to work on it if you so wish. It is available this evening after class. So it unlocks at that point, I believe, and will it's a good amount. It has no. So the other thing that's probably most important about it is that it has no time limit. Okay, so take your time. Look at each question very carefully. This is so the way I do quizzes, and I apologize if this upsets anyone, but the way I do quizzes generally is I'm kind of like the DMV. So I offer you the best answer for the question, and my distractors tend to be a little mean-spirited sometimes, but I try not to make them too nasty. So I've gone to added lengths. I've bolded certain sections of letters and words in the questions or in the possible answers for you to really consider. And so if you read things very carefully, so this is partly like, I want you guys to do well, but also I want you guys to do well. I want you guys to kind of get this material. So this is part of being capable and understanding your way, understanding kind of which way is up with After Effects requires kind of some of this core knowledge. And so that's why when we talk through some of these slides, we talk through some of the behaviors that we'll see in After Effects, ask questions. I'll do my best to answer them tonight. Definitely don't despair. It's not, some of the questions you will have seen already because they're duplicated from the quiz that you took a few weeks back. And yeah, so we'll go into more detail as to kind of what to expect on that quiz or on that midterm. Okay, and then we'll do our in-class activity, which I hope to have. I'll give you specifications. I may have to write them on the whiteboard because I don't think I have a slide for them, but we'll get to that. Just say we're almost to the festival, so that's why my film festival is taking all the air out of the room, and so here we are. Okay, so some questions from last week. Generally pretty good in terms of the content. So let's start off with when I went to export my project in After Effects, it gave me a couple of different options to do so. Is there a certain one we should be using? I am remiss in not telling you the techniques to use for After Effects in terms of how you export a particular project. You know, we talked all about doing things in After Effects, and then I neglected to mention, oh, by the way, when you export things, here's the best way to go about it. So in the spirit of that, if you were unable to export your projects, then, you know, let me know.
There's always the internet.
There's always the internet that does talk about this stuff as well. Right. So generally speaking, the idea is which one of these is the right choice, right? So a lot of people are like, wait, which one should I choose? Adobe's orders them in this order for a reason, okay? They want to push everybody towards using Adobe Media Encoder for exporting their media, okay? That doesn't mean that's the necessarily always the right choice, but for the projects and the homework that you're turning in, generally speaking, sending it to Adobe Media Encoder is a good plan. You probably won't go wrong. Probably. Though some of you did have problems with encoding your finals from last week or 2 weeks ago. But that was Premiere, not After Effects. So again, I'm thinking, what am I going to expect to see from this week's homework? All right. So if you do decide to send a particular composition to as an export to Media Encoder, when you do that, the instant you do it, it's going to launch Media Encoder, and you'll see that down here it launches a new icon. In Windows, obviously, it drops another icon on the bottom of your screen, and then after some period of time, and I'm not kidding, it does take a little bit of time, you'll see it pop up on the screen. In the meantime, you can choose to go to the render queue. The render queue used to be the primary way to do this. Let me turn off the lights real quick so that it's a little easier to see the screen and maybe not hear the buzzing. So when you choose to use the export queue or render queue, you get you end up with this kind of stack of jobs, and each one of these is a separate composition in the queue. So if you went back up here and say went to export it again and add to the render queue, you see it adds a second one to the queue here. So, and it starts with the top. This was the first one we added. This is the second one. So, and it tells you the status. It says it needs to be output. It also has some render settings, which and then of course Media Encoder pops up. I'll talk about Media Encoder in just a moment, but let's get through the render queue first. So you have a couple of things to look here. You actually have some presets available to you, and the three are render settings, output module, and output 2. The render settings are, you know, these might not seem particularly helpful. Always understand that when they're blue and they light up like this, you can click them, and it will bring up a dialog that shows you all of the settings and knobs that you can turn for this. So you'll see that of this, what we're doing in terms of render settings is this has to do with how After Effects is going to send the composition to be rendered. So are you going to use the best quality settings? Are you going to use draft settings? What size is it going to be? Is it going to be full resolution? Are you going to, you have the ability to override the condition of the composition. And I had kind of made it, I alluded to this earlier, is that you have the ability in the render queue or in the render queue to basically turn all effects on or off. Okay? Or you can go with the settings that are in the composition as it is currently set in the project. Same thing for solo switches. You can turn solo switches on and off. You can force every layer to be displayed. Guide layers can be displayed or off. Usually that is, guide layers are like these, the action and title safe. And then color depth, you can actually choose the color depth of your composition separate from the composition settings itself. So anyway, that's just be aware that this is one of the 3 settings for every export. The output module is actually how it's going to be encoded. So, you know, what are you going to encode? How are you going to encode this this composition? And you have some presets. Again, I don't really use the presets as they are, but I would come in here. You can choose QuickTime. You can choose. These are where you would choose if you were working with a VFX shop. You're working with a large studio. You might do OpenEXR, which is you know, a very high fidelity format, but it is like super not compressed. DPX or Cineon, which is the kind of the precursor to OpenEXR. So if you're working with a VFX house, that's these are settings that you'll want to use, but you don't normally you can export as PNGs or Photoshop PSD files, etc. If you come into QuickTime, then you have all of QuickTime's codecs available to you. But what you'll notice is what's missing from here, and used to be on here, is H.264. Okay, so if you're looking to export to like an MP4 format, the render queue is really not the place for you. Which is why I say that if you're going to do your homework in, you know, you're going to export out of After Effects for turning in something, you're probably going to use the media encoder as your platform or your export channel. You can use QuickTime. You can go in here and using QuickTime, you can choose H.264. So you do have that, but it's through the QuickTime codecs, not through its native rendering. Okay. All right, so that's that. And then finally, you have an output preset. You can actually preset a name for the file that's going to be generated. So you can do where the folder is located, and then it's going to say all audiences. So it's going to be all audiences.mov, and you can actually change that up here as well. Just by clicking on the name here, you can actually change this to read whatever you want it to read. Okay. Sure.
So I looked up online how to export it, and it told me to go to composition and then add to render. It's the same wording. Does it matter if you go from composition or from file to add to render queue? Because the same stuff happens.
It's generally the same thing with file. If you choose something from here, you can add this to the render queue separately, I believe. Okay. So you can actually add a render of an Adobe Illustrator file to the render queue directly from After Effects. So but if you select a composition, if you have one of these selected, or if you select one of these, if this is the current selection, when you go to the file export menu, it's the same thing as going to composition.
And the other thing,
yeah.
When I went through the process you just did with the render, I put it on QuickTime, but then when the other box came up, H.264 is not an option.
Yeah, and that happens. You'll see that. So that's why it's on a Mac. I think it is more. It's available on if this is Windows, or is this a Mac? Yeah, on Windows. Because the QuickTime codecs on Windows are not like fabulously current, it's not. The idea for the render queue is if you're working with a studio or something along those lines where they want really high fidelity output, like I said, PNG sequence, Photoshop file sequence, OpenEXR, DPX, those sorts of things. That's where you can access those, and it will generate basically a directory full of still images. Every every frame of your film would be one of those files. Okay, so it's like literally individual. So that's accessing. So when you're going to, and I'll say this, trying not to spend a lot of time on it, but I'll say this is that generally speaking, where the industry is headed right now is everything is starting to gear themselves towards what's called digital cinema packages. How many of you got heard of DCP? 1, 1.5. Okay. DCP is for filmmakers. It's the best approximation of sending an actual exhibition, like a reel of film that was printed of your film. It's the closest approximation to that that's currently out there. All studios that send out films to your local theaters send them in this format, DCP. Okay, so it's just a file format, but inside of it is technically the way it's encoded is that it's a series of individual images. Totally different matter on that front. It's also encrypted, and there's a whole back office thing about that. But yes, it would be okay. It's just you have to be careful that it's not too huge. I mean, I don't want you to export a file for me that is multiple hundreds of gigabytes, really. So I would like to, and so to that end, I've also started to modify my grading rubric. So you do get points for, first of all, you get points for turning it in on time. You also get points for turning it in the correct format. So above and beyond actually the homework itself, did you do the things that needed to be done in the homework? But also there's these little side pieces that help encourage you to think about how you're exporting things, because you lose points if you don't do that. So anyway, all right. Need to move on, but let's go quickly over to the Adobe Media Encoder. How many of you have used the Adobe Media Encoder for your projects at any stage? If you've used Premiere, actually, technically speaking, if you've used Premiere, you have used Adobe Media Encoder. It's just you might not have realized it at the time. It's just you were using the same encoding engine just inside of Premiere Pro itself to export your media. So when you go to export media in Premiere Pro and you click export as opposed to queue, you're still using the same code, the same coding, the same codecs. It's just you're using them as kind of like tucked into Premiere, but it's not like a separate facility that's totally separate from this. So just keep that in mind. It is they are related to each other. But for Media Encoder, this is like the 2-minute tour. I really don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but if you do export to Media Encoder, you're going to have a queue tab right here. Your project, whatever you're exporting, is going to show up in here. And what's funny is it looks very similar to the render queue. You have a format. You have a preset. So your format is kind of like, what's the file output? Okay. Notice that they do have DPX and OpenEXR, so you can access them through this. But you can also, you have a lot more fine control inside of After Effects when you send jobs that way. You have obviously H.264, and then you have a bunch of presets here. You can also click on this and it will open the, so see it's saying connecting to Dynamic Link Server. It's basically opening up what looks like a Premiere export settings box, and you can make all of your export selections there. And then you also have an output file location, which you can click on and then set a location inside your on a disk. Okay. This is the, like I said, as far as Adobe desires, the fact that this is in first position on this little submenu flyout tells you what Adobe wants you to do. They want you, if you're going to export media, they would like you to send it to Adobe Media Encoder. And they're starting this started like 3 or 4 years ago, where they started to kind of peel off functionality out of the render queue and leave it only in Media Encoder. So that's why I had to change my tune, where I was like, originally I was like, the render queue, it's like Media Encoder, only totally different. And now it's like, no, they're funneling you towards that. Okay. Great question. Sorry I didn't catch it last week. Now we have a raft of these kinds of questions, which is hilarious because what kind of media types are supported by After Effects? So a lot is the short answer. The what kind of media types that you can run into? It can be almost any kind of still image media type that you're probably likely to encounter, whether that's BMPs, PNGs, JPEGs. You can also put in vector graphics, so it can be SVGs, Adobe Illustrator, embedded PostScript, and so on. We'll play with the EPS file tonight. Then you have, it can actually take audio, and we'll talk about that in the next question. But so you have all kinds of media type, any kind of video. So again, it can be QuickTime, it can be MP4, it can be any of the variety of media formats that Premiere takes in. Can also be imported into this because, and again, that's because Premiere, when you have that dynamic linking between Premiere and After Effects, where you say, send this clip to After Effects, you want that media to be loaded in After Effects as well. So they kind of share that same capability in terms of what media types they will accept and use. There are media types that probably I've not run into one personally that was like a glaring, oh no, it doesn't work. But there might be one out there. So I won't say that absolutely it takes all media types, but it's pretty broad. Can you edit videos on After Effects? This is where I'm going to take a drink and let that soak in. Why would you want to edit videos on After Effects? I'm open to hearing your suggestions. That's probably the best answer right there. Okay, is probably the best answer.
Well, I would disagree.
Oh, come on, David, tell me.
Just because, and vice versa, my buddy animated and did an entire short film in Premiere. All the stuff you're supposed to do in After Effects, but he did it in Premiere. It took him 4 years to make the film, but.
Okay, fair criticism. Now, understand the following. Premiere is a video editor with some animation capabilities. After Effects is an animation platform. Can you edit videos on After Effects? So the short answer to that is you can. Should you edit videos on After Effects is a much more philosophical and probably appropriate question to ask in this class. It is using the wrong tool for the job to edit anything in After Effects. I have seen people try. I've seen students try, and it is a nightmare exercise. You don't want to do this if you don't have to, because every cut, every clip every edit is a new layer in After Effects. Okay? So every edit you make in the video would be a new layer. Seriously. So that is how you edit in After Effects. Please, please, please don't edit in After Effects, because the number of layers quickly, I mean, if you have any amount of edits, it'll balloon very quickly beyond your ability to control or comprehend. So just, yeah, be safe out there. Be safe out there. All right. Next question. Is it possible to edit audio in After Effects? So this is why I said, wow, these are all related. I love it. I'm going to group them together. Actually, no. This is one of the things where I can say pretty equivocally that After Effects sucks I mean, can you edit videos in After Effects? Yes, you can. Should you? Absolutely, you shouldn't. Can you edit audio in After Effects? Not really. You can cut audio if all you're going to do is cut audio, but you cannot apply audio effects to it. You cannot apply fades to it. You cannot do. I mean, you're very, very limited because After Effects is not an audio workstation. You have one. We talked about it. Week 2, week 3. You know, Audition does all of that. After Effects, please don't do this. It's not designed for that. It's designed if you need to have audio as a way to mark cues for things that happen in your composition. Absolutely have audio included, but don't try and edit it inside of After Effects. That road leads nothing to misery. Is it possible to animate properties of the character panel? So this was an interesting one. So let's talk about that. So when you look at the character panel, let's bring that up here. Character panels over here, you look at it, you say, well, how do you can you animate any of this? There's no way to animate it using the character panel. However, there are some options in here, not a lot, but really they're the only things that you can easily animate inside of a text layer are going to be, path op. Well, you can orient this text on a path. Sorry, zoomed out on me. You can also do some specific animations here. You also have this animation menu, which we really haven't gone into, but there's a whole host of specific actions you can add to this layer by selecting off this menu. You can change the fill color, you can change the stroke, the width, and all this other stuff. And almost all of these aspects can be changed, can be animated. Okay, but however, things like these values. So yeah, can you set the font size? No, but can you set the scale? Yes. Okay. And since it's a vector graphics layer, it continuously rasters, so it's like font size. Can you do kerning, or sorry, leading here? You cannot set it here. It's not keyframeable. But if you have more than one text layer, you can obviously spread them over time separately. But that's not something that in and of itself is animatable. So just be aware of that. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can, All right, I won't say that it's totally impossible. There's probably some method of using expressions that might get you there. But honestly, there's more likely there's probably a more easy to sort out way to animate what you're doing. On it, and again, if you're going to if you want to change the font or the typeface and other stuff like that, you're better off just cutting to a different from one font to another. Is just duplicate the layer, change the font face, and have it instantaneously switch from one typeface to another. There's better solutions that are already in After Effects that would probably be less confusing to an animator. All right. Okay, so would you mind explaining exactly what the differences are between solo versus hide versus shy? Fair enough. Cool. So the idea of soloing is this column right here, the dot column on here is, and any what you'll notice also is that any invisible layers cannot be soloed. So if the eye is turned off, the solo becomes unavailable to you. You cannot click the solo. So hiding is basically whether a layer is actually visible. All right. So if you're going to turn a layer on and off, you know, that's what this is. That's what that's for. That's what hiding's about. Hiding is just, and sometimes it's necessary due to if you're doing track mats or other things where it, you know, After Effects automatically hides it for you. That's another matter. So soloing obviously is where you want just one thing to be visible on screen at any moment, or if you select multiple things, then multiple things can be on screen, but it's like you're forcing them and everything else. So it's a little bit of an absolute, like just these things are visible. So you're forcing their visibility to be on and forcing everything else to be kind of hidden temporarily. It's not meant to be a permanent solution for, I wouldn't generally want to export a composition that had a bunch of solo, like if you did something like this, it would be very weird to export that just to have a black background when you could clear this and just do that to get a black background. Okay, so that's the difference. And then for shy is just a way to keep things organized. So say, for instance, we had a bunch of layers. So we had like a comp with this many layers, okay? It's an enormous amount of I mean, you got to scroll and scroll and scroll to find things, right? So it would be very complicated. If you went in and said, you know, I only need the first 20 layers to be hidden, or the first, I only need these don't touch me's to be visible right now. So I'm going to basically click and drag my mouse upward so that all of these have the little shy button. Now, when you click this, they all disappear, but they're still visible on screen. So that's not actually turning the layers on and off. It's just hiding them in the layer view so that you can work on the layers that you care about working on, okay? Because compositions, it's hard to keep things straight in comps sometimes. You can have compositions with enormous numbers of layers, but it's not a particularly optimum way to organize it. So yeah, the counter argument to can you edit in video in After Effects is, oh, well, you can just shy the layers as you go. It's like, well, yeah, but why would you do that? All right. So that is the difference between hiding with the visibility, soloing, and then the shy marker is that if for any reason, also while you have this set to blue, if you click on any layer, it automatically hides that layer. So you can have a completely empty layer stack. You're like, there's nothing in this comp. It's like, of course there is. It's just hidden from view. Okay. Any questions on that? Great, moving on. I'm going to revert this because that was a lot of duplicating. All right. What's the difference between transform opacity versus transform and animate opacity versus animate? That's a great question. Let's find out. So opacity is under the transform group. If you actually twirl this down and you look under transform, these end up being a lot like the fixed effects that you find in Premiere. So for any particular media clip that you have in Premiere Pro sequence, you have fixed effects. We talked about that. Transform group is a lot of those similar things: anchor point position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So you have all of those available to you here. Whereas you can also, animate opacity. And so what it is that you can actually, you actually are, when you do it from the animator, you're adding it to the content of this. So let's see if there's another thing that so under the contents, you'll see that when you look at this this animate menu, it's on the same line as the content of that layer. So it's like if it's a text layer, then they animate there. Under contents, you can't animate because you're adding things to a shape layer. For these, you don't have the ability to add that. So really what you're talking about is animating opacity of text. And that's what this is right here. So you can actually come in here and change the opacity of just one thing. Now, is that any different from the transform group? the idea is that you can, I believe, have more than one range. So you can actually choose which letters. Let's see. Now this is where the opacity here will be fun. Is you can choose which letters get applied. Can you see what I'm doing here? So as I increase the start number on the range selector in this group, and you can follow along with this if you really want to, but right here, you'll see that actually the opacity is only being applied to the last letters here. These are all remain fully lit up. I mean, they still are under the control of the master opacity, right? I mean, so you can still do that, but it's a distinct capability. So you can choose, and you can animate these. You can animate the start and end. So this can be an animatable piece where you can kind of, you can get little chase sequences of letters, and that's something that you could choose to animate. So the idea behind the opacity animator has to do with range selection, not so much that it's identical to the transform group opacity. Good question, though. All right. So once again, I'll revert and go back to the questions. We're almost there. How long should a text in the lower third optimally be on screen in order to be fully absorbed by the viewer? That's actually something we'll really kind of talk about tonight. But in general, for titles, and you'll see this also. So what I will say is that when you talk about titles, credits, things of that nature for film, there's a couple rules of thumb. If it is roll credits, you should time this with a stopwatch sometime. Watch a Hollywood film that's not like rebroadcast on TNT where they kind of zip it through the screen, but watch a film and actually time the amount of time it takes for somebody's name to emerge from the bottom of the screen and to the time that it falls off the top of the screen. That elapsed time is basically 8 seconds. Okay? So if you do this, if you actually were to create a roll credits where it took 8 seconds for somebody's name to go from top to bottom and you play it, you're going to be like, wow, that looks like it's just like you'd see in a movie theater. That's right, because that's what they do. So there are companies whose job it is to make titles for movies, and that they've landed on this formula. And I thought that it might be contractually based. It might be something where, as part of the contract for a particular person, is their name needs to be visible for a certain period of time. But for roll credits, usually it's not principal people. If you're talking with A-list actors or other stuff like that, you're probably negotiating for what they call a card, which would not be a roll credit. It's just their name on screen by itself. Or sometimes two up. I mean, depends on, how much cachet they have, how much pull they have. But how long credits should be on screen? Generally, for cards, it would be 5 seconds. For roll credits, 8 seconds from the time their name emerges to the time it disappears. And you almost could set your watch to that. Lariva.
I'm not a professional editor or animator or anything, so I'm just kind of curious. It seems like there are so many different options that you can use in each of these programs. So what drives that? The film industry in terms of what they actually use when they're putting together an After Effects program, or what is giving us so many different options, and how often is it actually used, as opposed to just being 50 million ways you can do one thing?
Well, yeah. I'm sorry to report that I believe the answer is probably because there are many ways to skin the cat, and this has been built over a long period of time. The fact that you can accomplish things in multiple ways in After Effects is not a shortcoming. So, it's just like looking for a job. It's like you don't need 100 jobs. You just need the one. You just need one to work for you. And so if you can find one technique that works for you in After Effects that gets what you need done, you're good. You don't need, would you benefit from learning other techniques? Perhaps. Does that mean that you would change your practice to use those techniques? If it doesn't add any value for you, you shouldn't. You have your practice. Now, if it's clearly a better way, clearly more efficient, clearly more obvious or more elegant, then the argument becomes a little less like, no, you should just stay with the way that you've always done it. Whereas you might be like, oh, hey, wow, I hadn't thought I could save time by doing it this way. So yeah, the fact that there are multiple ways to do things in After Effects is not a bug. It's not a shortcoming. It's how things get done. Part of it is and part of it is answered by the usual, the rabbit hole has no bottom. There's no, the depths to which you can research this. I still haven't found the bottom of the rabbit hole, and I've been at this for a while. So yeah. Okay. I know that's not a satisfactory answer really, but
somebody coming at this for the first time and just seeing so many different options, it's like, who uses this? So I guess I'm just kind of curious.
Sure. Yeah. And the answer is that people use it in different ways for different means too. I mean, After Effects wasn't always kind of the 800-pound gorilla that it is now. So, all right. I think that's it. Yes. Okay. Whew. So in just a few minutes, we're going to go through some of the basics of keyframes. I expect that Michael McKeever will be here in about 10 minutes or so. So we'll go through that. I'll I'll step out. He'll ask his questions for you. And then we'll, after you're done, kind of give it 10 more minutes and then we'll pick back up. So keyframes, let's have a look at some of the basics here. So the idea behind keyframes, and this should not be news to anybody at this point, but to enable keyframes in After Effects or in Premiere is that you have the little stopwatch that allows you to enable animation for any particular parameter that you want to modify over time. So, and that's kind of the definition of animation here, is that animation is not just about position. It's not just about X and Y. It's also about opacity. It's about rotation. It's about how things rotate. It's also, when you think about rotation, you have a notion of where is the axis point around things which things rotate, right? And that's so you have rotate, but you also have this idea of an anchor point, which moves the basic part that allows you to choose how something behaves when you rotate it. So there's a relationship between all of these parameters, and they're all, for every single layer in After Effects, you have at least these 5 parameters that you can mess with. And generally speaking, you can also mess with them beyond this. There's, let me see, there might be a way, in fact, yes, we will talk about a way in which to split these apart to make, more trouble for yourselves. So as a refresher, if anyone needs it, is you have the ability to, we'll start with, say, let's not do a text one, we'll use the outline. So we'll take the logo here. In fact, what we'll do is we'll solo it so that we can kind of see it in its element here, and we'll move it up here. Maybe we will we'll shy away all of these so that we can just look at the one thing that we're looking at. So the humble logo that's been made into a shape. So how many ways can you modify it, or how many ways can you animate this? So again, you have, and in fact, it has an opacity already applied to it over time using these keyframes. But you have the ability to change the position, obviously. And if you desire to, if you desire to, you can actually just move this to a different time and then physically move it. And what you'll notice is that when you do change the value by moving that position, it actually automatically creates a new keyframe for you in After Effects. And you'll see that there's that little tether, okay, that goes from here to there, and that actually is the path that this animation will follow. So a couple of things that are interesting to note there is that if you just look at that, you're like, okay, so there you go. It goes from point A to point B. Understand that you have a considerable amount of flexibility here, and we'll get into some of those. You can choose also to move down the timeline and have the animation move somewhere else. Move down the timeline, have the animation move somewhere else. Move down the timeline, and have the animation move again. So you can also decide to have it come back to its original spot. You can also, so you have the ability to have it move over time to any point by just the simplest way of keyframing animation. And this kind of keyframing is called spatial keyframes, because it's how it's changing the over distance. So it's the coordinates changing over time.
Was that a Photoshop file?
No, this was originally it's originally an Illustrator file. Okay. Tonight we're going to actually take an EPS, or an embedded PostScript file, and we're going to create a shape layer from it, just like what this was done. So you'll get that opportunity to play with that. Okay, so you've got these keyframes. That's great. You can keyframe motion over time. The other thing to understand is that you can actually, on the screen, when it's positioned, these spatial keyframes, you can actually change these at any point to modify the path of travel. So you don't have to, it's not a one time you do it, but every time you do this, you're actually going, what the behavior actually is that when you're changing this, you're actually, changing these values, but just for a place on the timeline that you don't currently see. So when you're modifying this keyframe, you're actually changing this value right here, but you're only changing its position. So the value of X and Y for this particular keyframe is modifying as you drag it around. And once you drop it, it resets, it sets it that new value. But its position on the timeline is still right where it is. Okay. So the other part, the other facet of keyframes is that they have values, and then they have a kind of a time, basically a point in time in which that keyframe is set. So if you wanted to, you can move any of these keyframes along the timeline as well. And when you do that, watch what happens here with these beads, these little, and so, well, I'll describe what those beads are. So each of these little dots that are in between the keyframes are the interpolated location of where that layer will be positioned for that time. So it's like you have this dot right here, and if I page down holding the mouse right there, you'll see that's where the layer goes. If I put a mouse over here and I page up to move to this frame, you'll see that that's exactly where the anchor point drops, is where that dot is located on this timeline. So anyway, so as you move these keyframes around, this time I'll do between these two. Watch what happens between here and there as I move this keyframe in the timeline. Okay, so what you're noticing is that as you move it towards when you move this timeline, this keyframe closer to this one on the timeline, you have fewer frames. That's because obviously its velocity is increased. It has fewer frames to go from this point to that point, and so it's got to book it. It's got to get over there as fast as possible. So that this aspect of interpolation, this aspect of keyframe is called temporal. So this is the temporal quality of keyframes, is where they're located on a timeline. And for positional keyframes, it's spatial. These are spatial values where they're located on the coordinates. And they are related, but not in an obvious way. All right. Okay, so generally speaking, how many of you guys have heard about easy ease of keyframes? One person? Two. Okay, thank God. All right, so that's okay. You'll learn it tonight. So you can do this in Premiere. You can actually ease the motion between points. So when you do that, you actually can let's set it up between these 2 points here. So between here and there, actually I'm going to delete these so that we've got just this linear motion again. So if you select these and you go, well, actually I don't usually do it through, but you can do it through the animation menu, which is under Keyframe Assistant. You can easy ease. You can always press the F9 key on your keyboard. And you can also, instead of using the animation menu, you can control or right click and go to Keyframe Assistant there to do the same thing. And the idea is that you can select easy ease. And what this will do is it creates kind of a default way of smoothing the animation as it leaves a keyframe and as it arrives at a new keyframe. Okay? So let's see what that looks like here when we do that. First and foremost, when you change that, you actually change the shape of the keyframe. Keyframes used to be a diamond, and now they look a little bit like hourglasses. Okay? Important thing to note is that these hourglasses do have 2 sides to them, and we'll talk about what that means later on after the break. So, but now let's look at what the motion looks like when it leaves this keyframe. It's going to take off, and then and maybe it makes more sense to move this over time. Oh, sorry, they're both selected. Haha, good times, Randy. If we add some more keyframes in here, it helps a little bit more to understand what's happening. If we preview this, you'll see that the difference between this is that the motion is a little smoother. I'm going to basically move my workspace to here, and then moment. So as you do this, and by the way, what I was doing there is just changing the workspace so that I'm only looking at the frames I want to look at right now. You have that ability as well in the timeline. So you can see that it starts a little smooth and it kind of ends smoothly. The other option would be that if you go back to the original keyframe of, well, actually in this case we would have to do, nah, I don't want to do it that way. I want to do frame interpolation. Yeah, all right. So I'll show you this in a second, but this is really what. So the idea behind these, we will talk about what I just did in just a moment, but I want to show you what it looks like without it. Is that it takes off very suddenly and then ends very suddenly, right? So it's very, that's because the distance from here to there, from this, and see there, I did it. I use the arrow keys instead of the page up and page down. So the distance between here and there is exactly 1 fraction of the total distance from this frame to that. So however many frames it takes. So say it was, we start at 10 frames. That's where we're at right here, 10 frames. And we go to 20 frames. The distance from here to there is exactly 1/10 of the distance between here and there. Okay, so it's very equidistant. The distance between each of those interpolated keyframes is the same. When you ease it with, this time I'll use F9. Oh, this time I actually have to use FN F9. This is super convenient. But so if you ease these keyframes, the distance from here is actually shorter than, and this is a little bit longer. And then this is, you can tell visibly that this is a lot longer still. And then and now you're at the midpoint. So now it starts to reverse. This is the same distance as that. This is a little shorter, a little shorter, a little shorter, and shorter still, so that the motion ends up looking more smooth over time. So that, and I need to stretch it back out so that it makes sense, because that's just too much. Too much. So get to there, and so again, it's easier to see when the distance between these keyframes is greater. So the longer time it takes to go from point A to point B, you can see that the motion is a little more smooth. Okay, that's all. That's easing. That's the cheap, poor man's way to soften up animation for you. He's not here yet. That's upsetting. Tell you what, so it's 8 o'clock and I want you guys to have a break, stretch your legs, kind of collect your thoughts. We will, let's resume at about 10 after, and then hopefully Michael will be here and we can, carry on with the next part of where we were talking about keyframe basics. And I think we've kind of covered them right here. So I'm going to douse the lights so that we see the screen again. So let me quickly get back to.
Just a very quick question.
Sure.
You don't have to go into detail. The smaller dots, are those tweens?
Yes, that is basically when you talk about how interpolation, the other word for that that's commonly used, it was used a lot longer ago in like Flash animation, was tweening. So it's those are the interpolated locations that the computer is kind of automatically placed for you. So, all right. We hinted at this earlier. I showed you this just briefly because I was going back to correct it. But so remember when I talked about the types of keyframes that we have two types that you get to choose from, that they are temporal and spatial. Okay, so just thinking so temporal having to do with time, where the keyframe is located on the timeline, and spatial meaning how it relates on the screen in terms of coordinates. Spatial really only has to do with keyframes that are coordinate based. If they're not coordinate based, this actually will be grayed out, but we'll get into that. So the other thing is that we might have time to look at real quick, though it's not necessarily relevant to tonight's activity, is roving, which I'll show it to you really quick because we had that animation in place. It's actually pretty quick to show you. All right, so remember we've got, right now we have these two keyframes that are that show this motion over time from 2 to 8 seconds, or no, sorry, it's actually about a second worth of motion. But so if we go back to the way that we had it before, which was if we wanted to change how these behaved, that's when I said that we can go to the keyframe interpolation, and you'll notice that it shows you temporal interpolation and spatial. And then you have these options on here. The options that you run into are linear, which are the diamond-shaped keyframes that you see here. So if you flip that to linear, you see that the keyframes are diamond-shaped. If you switch to any of the following, Bezier, continuous Bezier, or auto, I think one of these might be a circle, but if you switch to Bezier, you'll see that they turn into that hourglass shape, which is basically the easy ease, notion of keyframing. Pardon me. And you do have the ability to do what's called continuous Bezier, which is in this, when you only have two keyframes, it's not as obvious. and then you have finally the, oh, and also if you hold down Command while you, or Control on your Windows computers, and you click on a selected keyframe, you'll see that it changes shape. So if I click through it, it starts as a diamond and switches to a circle. When you do that, it actually is changing to what's called auto Bezier. Okay, and that's the third one that's down here. So Bezier and continuous are the hourglass. Auto is this kind of circular, and auto is basically letting After Effects decide how to if you have multiple keyframes, how they behave with each other. So let's actually add some more keyframes in here of motion. So again, I'm going to move this down here, move this over here, and move this back up here, and again back to. So this is what we had done earlier. Back to this first point is you'll see that it's as it moves through this, it's these look like linears. Why are they? Let's go back to this. If we go to linear, you'll see that they just kind of go from point to point to point in very linear fashion. If you select these and you switch their keyframe interpolation to Bezier, you'll see that they actually their position doesn't change because each of these actually has a the velocity, and we'll get to why that is in just a second, but the velocity hasn't changed. I think that when we switch this to continuous, no? All right, off in the weeds. Again, the way that, oh, that's why, because again, this is what makes it fun, is the what I'm actually changing is the temporal interpolation. Okay, this is just having to do with the velocity of keyframes between spaces on the timeline. If I go to the same options under spatial interpolation, you'll start to see some interesting changes here. If we switch this to Bezier and click OK, now all of a sudden everything's kind of swoopy doopy. If I do it, if we go back again and look at continuous, it doesn't look any different, and that's partly because currently these keyframes are already set to continuous as part of their setting, and then auto again. These become uneditable. Well, as soon as you edit them, they change, but when you switch them to auto Bezier, you're basically saying, hey, After Effects, you tell me what it should, how these should be set so that the motion is smooth. So what happens is the path that this follows becomes, and of course it's playing much faster. All right, let me spread this out a little bit so that it makes a little more sense. So I'll zoom this back, do it over 5 seconds. And if I hold down the Alt key, yeah, if I hold down the Option or Alt key and click the last of a selected set of keyframes, you'll see that you can spread and collapse things on the timeline. So this is a way that you can slow down an animation over time, such that it follows the path. But so the motion that's actually happening and the distance between keyframes has been set to this auto, or to this Bezier timing. So the velocity through any of these points is relatively smooth. Let's talk a little bit about well, the last option that was on there is when I showed you this option in the slide, you notice it was grayed out. So when you only have 2 keyframes on an animation, you can't use this option. But what roving has to do with is that if you have multiple keyframes, you can actually choose how these keyframes are behave in terms of their relationship as the object is moving through that keyframe and onto the next one. You can actually lock it to time, which is the default, which is basically saying that at that time you want to have that object pass through that keyframe at that moment. Or you can rove across time, which will basically turn these into a special variety of keyframe where you can't edit these quite like you normally would. See, they don't really show up in ways that you expect, but the motion between this keyframe and that keyframe across all of these waypoints becomes very smooth. So, and computationally expensive. So the velocity over time is very consistent from one frame to the next as it moves across from the start to the finish. Okay, so that's roving over time. Again, you probably don't need, you probably won't occasion to run into that, but when you do have a complicated path that you want and a piece of content or object to follow, this is an option that you'll be like, oh yeah, roving, that's what I need it to do. Okay, so going to quickly wipe these out and start fresh. Okay, so we're back at the keyframe position is set to its original locked piece. The next thing that I wanted to show you was the graph editor. Okay, and so this is where I consider the animation geeks kind of live in the graph editor in After Effects, because this is where you can provide the maximum amount of control and the maximum amount of frustration that you can run into when you're tweaking and fine-tuning how an animation behaves in After Effects. You can view in the graph editor, you can view speed, or you can view the value that a keyframe has over time. And it actually, this graph editor provides a wide variety of options here, and we're going to go through some of those right now. Okay, so to start with, let's once again choose. We can choose a couple of things. So we'll choose position and scale, and maybe that's fine for this one. We'll move out a little ways. We will move this out. We'll scale it, maybe scale it down a little bit, move it again, move the timeline again so that we can set a new keyframe, move it down here, scale it again. Well, maybe we'll scale it up this time, and so on and so forth, so that you can create a path. So that's what we're creating right here. This is the path that the animation is going to follow, and we'll start to shrink it again. So as we get to the end of this, we will move it back again to its origin, and I don't remember what it was set to scale at, but that's fine. We'll scale it down to that. I think 60 something was what it was. 67 was what it was. Okay, great. So now we've got, again, we have an animation. Now it's over 2 fields. It's now you're varying not just the position but the scale over time. These do obviously, when we set them in sync with each other, but that's not necessarily the case. You don't need, I mean, there's nothing that locks these 2 keyframes together. You can independently vary them as you so desire. But let's talk about the graph editor. So when you first click on the graph editor, you'd be like, where is everything? And that's partly because you don't have any, you don't have anything showing. You don't have any properties actually selected. So when you select the properties, then you start to see things happen in the graph editor. So anything that has a change in value over time will show here. Generally speaking, you look at this graph and you're like, what the heck am I looking at? And actually what it is the fact that it is moving from this keyframe to that keyframe. It's moving at 585 pixels per second. That's the velocity along that path, that segment. once it passes through that keyframe and starts here, it instantaneously slows down to 460 pixels per second. So the speed is actually varying from each point on this graph. Okay, so the speed is not constant. Now, just for fun, we'll say that let's select all of these, and if we were to we'll have to do this on animation. So keyframe interpolation, if you rove this over time, I think this is where you'll see the speed is now consistent. So that's what roving does in terms of when you have multiple keyframes from start to finish, is that you flatten this velocity. So it's constantly moving at 644 pixels per second, like you cared, but from this point to that point. So it's moving at a constant velocity over the entire time. Whereas normally it's going to, like I said, we moved it from here to there, and the motion is going to be it's going to move slowly here, or it's going to move fast, then it's going to slow down, it's going to move really fast, and it's going to slow down again, and then it kind of stays consistent with the previous values. So these two values don't change. Okay, so this is one view of the graph editor. You're looking at the speed display of the graph editor. So now you can actually click on this and you can show, you can click on this and it will show you what options you have. You actually have 3, but generally 2 that are relevant. What we're looking at right now is the speed graph. If you wanted to look at the value graph, you can click on it and it will show you the values of these keyframes over time. This is kind of where people expect to see the graph editor. They'll see that these values change from this point here to this point here to this point here. All right. So this might get you to ask the question, well, are there any questions right now in terms of what I've shown you so far? Because what we're about to do is another demonstration of the theory that the rabbit hole has no bottom, in that right now, when you look at position, you have to, the X and Y values are set, they're kind of tied together, aren't they? You can actually separate them by using this button down here called separate dimensions. And now you actually have 2 properties. So now you can actually edit the X dimension separately from the Y dimension. So if you know that you want to tweak one or another, you absolutely have that capability where you can come in here and modify these to and change their keyframe values independently of one another. So when you look at now that they're split out into these two properties, your X and your Y actually are separate keyframes entirely, such that you can change them. And this can get really weird really quick, but it shows you kind of the ability, if you wanted some set of keyframes to behave a certain way and the other set to behave, so dimensions start to not matter.
How'd you get the retransform?
You mean this?
Like you started dragging the logo around and doing keyframes.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's relatively basic, but yes, let's show you that. So the idea is, let's get back to where we have one set of these, is the motion would be that you would start from nowhere. So you'd start with no animation, okay? You'd pick a time on the timeline where you want animation to begin. So let's say half a second, 12 frames. You click the stopwatch to start setting a keyframe, and then move forward in time a certain amount. Maybe that's 6 frames. Maybe that's half a second. Maybe it's a full second, okay? And then you place this somewhere else. And by doing that, you actually introduce, because by moving that, you create a new keyframe here, a I mean, the other way to do it would be that you can move this to there, to say to 2 seconds, and you can come here and change the value this way by clicking and dragging back and forth on the value to set it where you want. And it will create a new keyframe that way as well. It's just the easiest way to quickly create a set of keyframes for motion would be to move the playhead where you want it to go, click and drag the object and place it where you want, or about where you want even. It doesn't have to be exact at this point for this purpose.
Yeah, like, that's all good.
Okay.
It's just not working on mine. I set the keyframes and I'm moving it around and I'm setting keyframes. Just keeps it and everything's the same wherever I place it.
Have you clicked the stopwatch?
Yeah.
Really?
I'm keyframing it. Yeah, I don't know why.
Keyframing. I'm gonna take a quick look.
Yeah,
This ought to be good. So let's see.
All right.
Yeah.
Not great.
You're not crazy. Oh, okay. So actually, you're animating an invisible object. The layer is hidden that you're animating. Okay, so choose the other layer. Choose the one that's visible and animate that one. There you go, David. All right, cool. No, that's actually really valid. So what he was doing, just for the benefit of everybody, not that I'm trying to make him embarrassed or anything, but he actually had both of these visible with the shy button, and he had been animating this layer right here, okay? And when he clicks and drags this around, he's actually dragging this layer, which wasn't keyframed. That's why you didn't see anything. But then he was like moving this one around and setting keyframes and doing stuff. He was moving the invisible Illustrator file around the screen. But since the visibility was turned off, I bet you if you just if you click the eyeball on that one, it would actually show up.
Yeah, see, now everything's working.
Okay, cool. So yeah, that's what we were looking at. Okay, no worries. No, that was a valid. Dude, I've run into that where you're like, well, I'm trying things and it's not working. What do I do now? And yeah, but as soon as I saw it, I was like, okay. So in that case, it's an easy fix. Okay, cool. So we have animation, we have all of this. Let's talk about, and we have the speed graph that shows you the values over time. You can split these depending on, you can use this button here to click separate dimensions so that you can independently vary the X and Y. And that comes in handy down the road. It's not important right now, but I wanted to show you that capability. What's next? The next thing, because I want to get to the point where we're almost there. We're close. We're not there, but we're close. Is let's go back. Yeah, all the varieties of the keyframes. So I've showed you that. So keyframe velocities. Okay, so this is the last thing I'm going to talk about tonight. Is the keyframe velocity. So this is the fact that every keyframe that you see on screen has two properties for it. You have an incoming velocity and an outgoing velocity. This is illustrated by the fact that you can see that you can see it on the speed graph. If you just look at position and you go to the speed graph, you can tell that the speed changes from here to there. So from this point to that point, the speed increases. So the velocity coming into this keyframe, this, by the way, is one keyframe, okay? This right here is one, whoops, sorry. This right here is one keyframe. It's the same keyframe. That's what's mind-blowing, is that instantaneously your velocity changes from the moment you coming into the keyframe for the moment you're leaving. So this is the incoming velocity and the outgoing velocity. So the incoming velocity is 63.3. The outgoing velocity is 906. So if we go to this keyframe and we go to keyframe velocity, we should see those exact values, 633, 906. Okay. If the outgoing velocity is 0, well, this will be interesting. It actually doesn't work because there's a connecting keyframe here. The idea, though, is that what happens is you create a situation where the keyframe doesn't know what it's doing. So what the behavior actually here, yeah, it turns this into a linear, or it turns this into a Bezier. But what I wanted to show you was the ability to create a so the in the keyframe parlance, you have linear keyframes, you have Bezier keyframes, you have auto Bezier keyframes, and then you have hold keyframes. So if you have a hold keyframe, this is what you see, is that if you were to, oh, that's how I access it. So if I were to take this and move this down to 0, it would effectively create this weird, yeah, it's still not working the way that it would you'd normally think of it. You have to create a hold keyframe, and what that does is it actually drops the velocity of that keyframe to 0. And what that means is that it kind of jumps. So once a keyframe hits that once that hits that point, it holds its position. Its position doesn't change until it hits the next keyframe, and then it instantaneously jumps to the next location, and then holds there, and then jumps to the last location. So hold keyframes are kind of like staccato. You want to hold it. You want it to stay in one place until the next keyframe, in which case you want the position to instantaneously change. That's like having your speed go to infinity and then back to 0. It's kind of weird. That's why the speed graph doesn't comprehend it very well. But most importantly, though, is the shape of the keyframe that you run into. If you see this, it actually creates a it actually is creating half of a Bezier keyframe and half of a hold. Hold keyframes are basically, there's 3 shapes in keyframes, and I'm sorry that I have to draw it on the whiteboard, so I didn't get to this in my notes. Man, this marker is toast. All right, this one's better. All right, so you have linear, right? And that's a diamond shape. Think of it with a line down the middle. You have Bezier, which has an hourglass sort of shape. Think of that with a line down the middle. You have auto Bezier. I'll just call it auto B, which is a circle, okay? And then you have hold, which is a square, all right? And the reason why I put that line down the middle of each of those is that the left-hand side is the incoming part of that keyframe, and the right-hand side is the outgoing. So because that's how they appear on the timeline, when you look here, the left-hand side is a Bezier keyframe, and the right-hand side is a hold. Now, what does that look like if you look at that in keyframe velocity? Is the actually, I think it has to do with influence. So the speed is actually 0, right? You're not going anywhere. There's no leaving or coming in. And the influence, I think if you set this influence to 0, it switches. Oh, no, that switches back to this. Some of this is comically fun to experiment with, right? And then we toggle, hold. That still wants to be obstinate. So if we toggle hold keyframes, we should see one of these turn into a proper, they're not playing. They're not cooperating with me today. So the idea of creating keyframes that hold the position over time and then instantaneously jump to the next one. Okay, so 4 types of keyframes: linear, Bezier, auto Bezier, and hold. Those are the 4 kinds of keyframes you'll run into in After Effects. There's 2 types of interpolation. There is temporal and spatial, right? There's the temporal, which is the the time or where a keyframe is on the screen, or sorry, on the timeline. And then there's the spatial, which is the location and the coordinates on the screen. What's the last thing? That's it. Yeah. So the next thing to talk about is what we're going to do for the remainder of the class period. Okay. And this is what we're going to have this will be a little more interactive. You have a question, Lariva?
I was just wondering, I had a question about the midterm, and I thought you said we were going to talk a little bit about.
Yes, we're going to talk about the midterm before we get into that.
Okay.
Okay. So to that end, since we're kind of at a point where what I'd like you to do is, if you can, and you should be able to, I'm going to close this project, and I'd like to open the one from week 8. So if you open your project, it should say week 8, lower third. And so what we're going to work on together to a certain degree, but also I'm going to kind of set some parameters for you here. And then I'd like you guys to expand on it and create a little further. Is we're going to create a lower third for a video clip. Okay. So you might recognize this guy. This is Dana Woodman from Chimera Arts and Makerspace in Sebastopol. I did the promo video for them. You watched that whole thing. That was earlier on in the term. We're going to make a lower third for him out of thin air. Well, not out of thin air. We're going to use some elements to do that. And some of the elements we're going to use include well, obviously that doesn't look very good because it's black on black. If I set the transparency. So yeah, it's the Chimera Makerspace logo, which is in a file format called encapsulated PostScript, which is a vector art form. And then we've got various paint splatters. So I was thinking, okay, an easy way to do this would be compositing some paint splatters with the logo revealed in some way. And that's something that we can talk about. And then displaying the text of his name and his position, which is the executive director of Chimera Arts. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing in just a second. So make sure that you open week 8 lower third.aep. And then let's talk briefly. I'll turn on lights for a sec here to let's talk briefly about what will be on the midterm, which once again, to remind you, it is online. So it's administered through Canvas as a quiz. It's in the modules. It unlocks tonight after class. And it is due Monday at midnight. So Monday before we come back. So the 26th. So you got like 2 weeks. And it pulls a lot of the questions. The first half of it are going to be questions that you've probably already seen from the first quiz, which talked about Premiere Pro primarily, right? Some Audition, some sound related things. And then the second half of the quiz or the midterm is going to be talking primarily of what we've covered in the last couple weeks with After Effects, including tonight. So there's talk of keyframes. There's talk of interpolation. So for your benefit, obviously you'll have this lecture will be recorded and up on YouTube Live, hopefully intact and sounding great. You'll also have, I'm going to give you the presentation that I used tonight. These slides will be up on, Canvas as well. So you guys can review these slides so you can see kind of the general feeling here of what these qualities of keyframes that are on here. The one thing that's not in my notes that might be on the exam, I'm not positive. I got to now think, did I actually talk about these in the exam? I did. Is the notion that there are different types of keyframes. So there's linear, there's auto linear, there's there's linear, there's Bezier, auto Bezier, continuous Bezier, and hold. Okay, that's actually a question. and that there's two sides to every keyframe. There's an incoming and an outgoing. Okay. Let me see if there's any other pressing questions that I haven't already kicked around for you guys. Yeah.
Do you have to take the midterm all at once, or can you stop? If you stop, you have to start all over again. I just want to know.
So, okay. So good question. I have not put a time limit on the midterm. Please don't be too abusive with this. I do that mostly because I want to make sure that in the circumstances where some students have requirements to have additional time to take the exam, I try to not make that a thing. But there's no time limit on the exam, but you only get one try. So if you complete the exam and submit it, you can't go back and take the exam again.
And you can't stop halfway through, because then
you have to. I would think you'd have to leave the browser window open, and if it closed for any reason, I don't know. It might. I don't know. So, should you do it in one sitting? Yes, you should probably try to do it in one sitting. You shouldn't try to like do a quarter of it, go to sleep, wake up the next day, go to work, come home, do a few more questions, go to sleep, wake up, and you just try not to spread it out over that much time. And again, don't if you do have the previous the previous quiz that is a basis. Some of you didn't do so hot on it, but I mean, again, you have to take the midterm in order to get a grade in this class. You don't have to take the quiz. You should, because that's some good points, and you don't want to like pass on that. But if you don't take the midterm or the final exam, I can't give you a grade in the class. I believe it is somewhere 25 questions. Okay. So it's not onerous. It's just, and again, this is mostly just testing your knowledge, how well you've picked up some of these the facts. The idea that it's not a practical exam, meaning that you're not demonstrating skills, is because you're demonstrating skills in the semester project. Okay, that's where you're going to demonstrate that you know what all of this stuff does. So, any other questions about what's is or isn't on the midterm? I'm not going to give you the answers. How's that? All right, Riva, what's up?
So, and I just want to confirm that what I saw in the quiz was that everything there was in your notes that you've given us at some point during one of the weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and that's why I crammed a bunch of knowledge into your head tonight too. Because I was looking at the questions today going, oh yeah, I got to cover that. So, I mean, I don't try to give you questions that are not what I've shown you. So admittedly, like I said, because we had issues with the lectures in earlier weeks, in terms of the recordings of the lectures, some of them are not going to be terribly helpful to you in that respect. I've tried to provide the slides from from each evening, if in that case, but a lot of it is, this is part of the reason why in the syllabus we tell you being in class is the key to unlocking success in this class. It's hard if you can't make it to class, you're going to struggle because there's a lot of information, and I can't answer questions all week long, though I try, but yeah. Okay. So yeah, I want to get moving on this. It's already past 9 o'clock. So let's talk about, in broad strokes, what we're going to accomplish here. Okay. So you guys know what a lower third is, correct? What is a lower third? Anyone?
lower half of the lower third of the screen, just text of who's talking, usually in interviews.
Some kind of title or text that appears somewhere in this general vicinity. Okay, so if you were to divide this into 3, then it would be anywhere down here. Generally speaking, though, it runs in a very narrow range. I do see sometimes people play with the right-hand side. In some cultures that it's more appropriate to, especially like Hebrew or Arabic, might be run off the right-hand side of the screen. Though I don't know. I've not personally seen that. Again, reminder that you do have these overlays that you can put in here for title and action safe. You should try to abide them but understand that these have to do with broadcast standards. They're not hard and fast rules for video, especially online video these days. People put text everywhere. But generally speaking, if you're putting text on the inside or on the very edge of this screen, it's going to be hard to read no matter what you're watching it on. People are used to seeing text kind of inside of a zone. Now that might be that might be just through practice and you know, there's been such a long-standing culture in broadcast of putting text in a certain place that viewers expect it to be there now. However, so you can use this as a guideline. You can also put in a grid. Whoa, that's kind of crazy. I wouldn't put in a grid. You can put in rulers to drop guidelines like you would in Photoshop. So if you wanted to use invisible guidelines to help you place text in a certain area, you can always do that as well. And then having this on the screen is kind of irrelevant because now you kind of know where you're putting things. So you have the ability to place guides. So that's what that is showing you, is the guides. If you want to leave them on screen, you're certainly welcome to. They won't render in the final product. For your information, I didn't add this to this, but I probably should have, is let's add a text layer. And I will put in here Dana Woodman. Let's size him appropriately. That's executive director sizing of text. And then a second text layer. So maybe we'll just put a new text layer down and type into it executive director, Camera Arts. Okay. So now you've got two pieces of text on the screen. One should be sized a little bit smaller than the other. Both of these can be, I've got them set to Helvetica right now for me. You can choose whatever fonts are available to you in yours. So you have a couple of, and this is a little cramped. Okay, so your minimalist lower third is going to look like this, right? And maybe you choose to size this a little smaller using the characters. We can size this to a little bit smaller, maybe not much. I mean, you can get a little out of hand with it, but so in this circumstance, because he has a dark blue shirt and the letters are bright white, you could call it a day with that. It's not, but this is After Effects and this is text animation, so we can do better than this. So that's where we will talk about this file, this Chimera. So let's take this out of the elements. So if you see the elements folders twirled up, you can click the little arrow, points down, look for Chimera _O, or no, it's Chimera -logo, sorry, .eps. And you can just drag that. You want to drag it anywhere on the top 3 layers. If you drag it underneath the video, it's invisible because it's under the video. If you drag it on top of the video, it'll be there. Next up is you can animate this as a logo in and of itself, as like a unique or a fixed thing in and of itself. But in After Effects, in order for it to be something that you want to manipulate in anything other than just the basic way, like transform, is you want to convert this. You want to take this vector shape and create something in After Effects that After Effects can comprehend, and that would be a shape layer. So when we right-click on this, or actually we right-click on this, it should be create shapes from vector layer. Okay, so that's this area right here. And as soon as you do that, it turns that EPS file, it hides it by turning the eyeball, the visibility off, and creates a layer directly above it that says Chimera logo outlines. Need a drink of water. Give me a sec. Okay. So what do you get when you create that shape layer from a group, or sorry, an Illustrator file? Is you get a bunch of polygons all grouped together, and they combine. So each group has is a group of paths that all overlay each other. So you can individually choose any particular path that's on here and treat it individually. You can also, where this gets interesting is that you can choose to modify individual components of this. So if you wanted to, you could turn the visibility of some elements off in the group. So if you wanted to strip this down to take some of the text treatment off, this is one way to go about it, where you can just remove, or you can just turn the visibility off for certain elements. And so all of the text that's on this this treatment, that's thinkers, makers, and all this other tagline stuff that's on here, can be removed just by turning the visibility off. Or you can just go in here and actually delete these groups. The next thing that you could do is you could actually create a separate shape layer. So you can come in here and go to create a new shape layer. And you can take some of these, like if we turn that off, that's the whole outlines. If you wanted to take that outline, and so everything from group 1 down to group 35, okay? So that might be a little bit much. Yeah, that might be a little bit much. We'll leave the Chimera there, but maybe it's just these lightning bolt wings, the Chimera tag, the lion gear head, all that. But groups 33 through 1, you can click them and just drag them up to this shape layer. No, you can't. You can't do that. No way, you can't do that. Man, I hate this game. All right, we'll cut it out, and then we'll come up here. We'll paste it in. Tell me what I can't do. All right, so now you'll see that the group is now moved up here. It's going to be a little bit more interesting because now the anchor points changed, because this shape layer has a separate anchor point from this shape layer. So now you have two things that are related to each other. Another way to have played this in the How Many Ways to Skin a Cat would be to have left these in the first group, taken this and gone up to edit, duplicate, and now you've got two of these shapes totally separate from each other, and you can remove groups 1 through 33 on this one, and groups 34 through 39 in the other one, and you've done the same thing. But now they're basically all the same. They're in the same location because they're identical. They're identical layers. They're not identical objects. Okay. All right, so where am I going with this? I'm trying to turn all the visibility back on. Okay, great. So now you've got two shape layers. So if you wanted to animate this, you could. If you don't want it to be black, you can change that as well. You can come in here, go to Contents, add a fill, and in that fill, you can change that to white. You can above, previous, and same group. So you can basically choose how this applies to the rest of the group members. So now you'll see that because we moved that to a separate group, now the chimera is just it's white on transparent, and we can now move this into a location where it can be part of this lower third, which of course means that now we need to move these over. So we'll move those over. Okay, so now you've got the idea of you've got the makings of the lower third that we're starting with. We don't necessarily need to have a background on that. We can make a background if you'd like. A simple shape would be fine in that sense. So we can come over here, actually turn off the shape, pick up a rectangle, and draw a rectangle on there. Don't worry the fact that it's red. Choose the fill, go back here. Let's pick something like a smoky gray. And maybe we don't want it to be matte, and we certainly obviously don't want it to be over top of the text, so we can drag it down so that it's underneath everything. And then maybe you're like, yeah, that blend mode's kind of boring. Maybe we can do an overlay so that it looks a little more interesting in that respect. The shape actually also has a stroke on it. That's why you're still seeing that line. So if you wanted to remove the stroke, just remove the stroke. And now you have this composite where, so now you can start to think about how to animate this onto the screen. You have what, four elements. So you've got 3 shape layers. Well, actually you've got 2 text layers and 3 shape layers. We're only really using 2 of those. So actually this one's up here and we're not going to use it for this. So we'll drive it down. Again, this is another fine opportunity to use the shy button to hide things you don't need or don't want to worry about right now. You'll notice that the video layer I did when I prepped the composition, I locked that layer because part of it is I don't want you to be messing with the video. The video needs to be where it is. So you can't move it. You can't mess with it. It's locked in place. You can't touch it on the timeline and affect it. So everything else should be working around this video layer. So as it plays, which is, Dana being Dana, he's talking to us. You can hear it if you run it through the preview, I believe.
Chimera is Sonoma County's first nonprofit community arts and makers.
All right, so you can hear what he's saying. It's only a 6-second video, 6.5 seconds, so it's not like there's much going on there. So now let's talk about what we can do with this. If we wanted this to be animated onto screen, we would normally want to, well, let's start with moving all of these off screen by hitting, we'll select all 4 layers, and you can press P to bring up the position. And then when we do that, we can move them using just the X values. Notice that most of them are in place here. We can actually just drag them off screen. Okay, so you can do this. If for any reason you're running out of real estate, you can always click and drag and then hold down the shift key, and it actually multiplies how fast things move. All right, so that's one thing we can do in terms of a starting point. So maybe once we get about halfway in, well, let's get a second in, and then what we want to do is we want to start animating this onto the screen. So we'll start with the that gray layer. Let's move that gray layer on the screen. So we'll keyframe the position, move forward. Let's move forward half a second. And I'm going to switch my tool to the selection tool, or press V. And holding down the shift key so it doesn't move up or down, I'll just move it into position like this. And since it's these are linear keyframes, that motion is going to be kind of jerky. So we can, using the keyframe assistant, switch this to easy ease. And so this first motion will be a relatively easy looking. Okay, so that's the first motion. Next up, we probably want to we can move the logo into place or the text into place. Part of it might be to have the logo. Actually, yeah, let's do this. I'll show you what I mean. So once we get the motion to about here, this might be the part where we say, yeah, now we want the Chimera logo to move into position. Okay, so now we want that to emerge onto the screen. And depending on how fast you want it to show up, you can always, if you need to zoom this out a little bit, you can move that original keyframe, again, holding down the shift key to make it so that the starting point is just off screen. Okay, so now the starting point's right there. Maybe the starting point should be just off screen. Okay, now it slides on, and again, we'll do easy ease on this. Now for the text, you know, if you animated the text to roll right over top of this, you'd see it kind of overlap each other. So what I'd like to consider is we're going to, how do I want to play this? I think this is a situation where pre-composing this might be a good choice. Because what I want to do is I want to create a mask for this area right here for these to emerge into. And I don't want to create two masks. I want to create one. So I'm going to come up here to layer pre-compose. We'll just call this Dana's name. It moves it to a new composition, and we're left with a single comp here that's actually, again, you know, sized to the you know, to the frame, and we can now move it into position itself. So we'll move this, hit P for position, keyframe that, move about, yeah, we'll move about a second. We'll keep it kind of slow, and we will click and drag to get, where is our text? Oh man, no way. So fail. So part of the problem with pre-composing is that we're creating something that's off screen. We need these to be on screen before we can make them disappear. All right. So grab these two, bring them on. Let's put them where we want them to be. Then pre-compose them. Come on, Randy. There we go. Layer, pre-compose. His name. Yeah, this is like nesting in terms of how it's going to present on screen. Now, when we move this position, you'll see that it's now on its own frame, so that's why it's showing. So the idea is that we want a mask to just sit right here, so that when his name emerges onto screen from the left, it doesn't overwrite this. So the way I do that is I would just come up here, and while this is selected, I'm going to select a mask area right here. And now when we animate this so that it comes on this way, we can now drop a position keyframe for the name, move it into, actually we'll move it out of position first. So that was like -118 or something. No, that's too far. Let's not move it that far. So we'll move it to just out of frame again. And then in about a second, we want this to be 960. Okay. So in that 1 second, and again, we'll easy ease these so that you've got the motion is relatively smooth. And now what you'll see is it's going to, as I scrub the timeline, you'll see the gray box comes in, the logo comes in, and then, wait, what? That's right. The mask has to be, yeah, I know. So how do we play this? The mask, what's that? The mask path has to be animated. And that's going to be a pain in the butt. Oh, I'm not looking forward to this. So we'll play it this way for now. This is the sloppy way to do this, but so yeah, in fact, it still wants to do that. It still wants to bob and weave, and part of that is when you look in there's an instantaneous speed here. So if I were to create hold keyframes there, oh, now it wants to. Oh man, this is so fun. All right. This, my friends, is not how you do this. I got to remember how I do this now. Darn it. My notes are totally wrong. So I'm now like, oh, that's right. Because part of the problem that we run into is when you're trying to map complicated, part of it is we're easing the motion of the pre-comp, and we're trying to linear the motion of this. Oh God, yeah, no, this is a nightmare. Let's not do it this way. Back out of this. Okay, there's another way. The good news is there's another way. So what we'll do is let's set a new layer. We'll do a solid, and we'll call this a white solid. Well, actually, we'll just set the color to white, and we'll name it that. Well, it would have named it if I'd left it alone. So we'll create a white solid, drop it underneath Dana's name. It's still invisible, and put a mask on that. Okay, so now with that layer selected, we will put a layer right here, and we will basically do a track mat on Luma. Okay, so now as that moves now, when we animate position on this, you'll see that, and of course I want it to show up later. So we'll come in here, we'll set the, so actually we can just move it like that. And once we ease this, we will have a completed, rough but completed lower third animation. Okay, this is just one way to roll this. This is not the only way to roll it. It is one possibility. Okay, so if we wanted to fit this on screen so it's a little more sizable, you can come to the beginning, hit play. Okay.
Here's the North Carolina's first nonprofit community arts and makers.
So and because the animation stops here, we can always choose, I'm zooming out with the minus key, we can always choose to just move the work area so that we can watch this animation play a few times and see if there's any changes we want to make to it. Okay, so some things that I notice right now is that it seems like the text is moving on a little fast. So it's a little better. You could move this a little further out so that the motion is just a little bit easier. Like I said, the further apart keyframes are, and you have Bezier keyframes, the smoother the animation will look as it comes into that keyframe. So if you wanted this to be like super, super tight, you'd do something like, but you don't want it to be too tight because you want it to be here just when that's cutting it kind of close. You're having the S show on right as that gray bar. So maybe this is not the way. If you wanted to smooth that even more, you'd have to resort to using the graph editor for this, okay? And this is a good use of the graph editor for this purpose. So actually, no, we'll stay with the speed graph and the position. And so you'll see that the speed is, it starts from a rest. This is what Easy Ease does, is it kind of makes this parabolic curve. And you have these two controls down here on either side. And using these, you can actually influence the degree to which this is changing over time. Remember, I use the word influence because it's right here, okay? Influence, the length of this little bar is what we're talking about right here, okay? So if we were to drag this so that its influence is 100%, and this is much smaller. Now when we go to look at keyframe velocity, you'll see, oh no, it's not that one. Where is it? Where did I put it, Randy? There we go. Influence is 100% coming into this keyframe right here, and that's what you want. Is you're basically expecting a very slow approach into this keyframe for the fact that the speed drops off a cliff and kind of comes to a nice slow stop. You'll see this a lot in motion graphics, by the way. So now when you roll through this, you'll see that it takes its time coming to a rest, though it's really fast at the beginning. That's because it's zipping in there from the speed slowing down. So what this looks like is like this. Okay, so you can affect how these animations roll onto the screen. Even though Easy Ease does this, that might not be enough for your taste. You might want it to be really smooth, and you can make that determination using the graph editor. I mean, if you know what you're doing, you can also do this with the keyframe velocity, but you're dealing with just numbers there. And so if you want a visual approach, the graph editor is your friend. So let's see what we've got again. Now the Chimera logo moves kind of quickly, so maybe we want this to be a little further out. So we're moving it further in time. So it starts later, so that by the time it comes in, maybe it's already moved through much of its motion, and it's actually already coming to a slow stop by the time it emerges on screen. Okay. The other part of this that I was going to suggest, but we're half an hour before the class is up. So if you wanted to play with this, this is an option. Take this file with you. If you want, you can put these media files. You have my permission to use them anyway. Take these media files and you can experiment with this over the break. But you have a variety of these paint spatters. And one of the things I was thinking of doing was, instead of this gray box right here, was doing colored splashes of paint from these spatters. How would you do that? One way to do it would be to, instead of that shape, you would probably pull one of these down into the screen. You would, obviously that's not going to work, but you're not really using this. You're just using what amounts to the luma of this layer to reveal something underneath it. And what would that be? What could that be? It could be a solid of a certain color. So maybe if you wanted it to be bright red, you could do a track matte on this, on a luma, and whoops, that didn't work because I'm doing the wrong thing. Right, sorry, other way. I need to put this underneath it and do a luma matte that way. Okay, so now you have these two are more or less linked together. But if you move this, the JPEG around on screen, you'll see that the red spatter kind of goes with it. And you can scale it. You can do all sorts of other things with it to make it more appealing to what you're doing. And you can animate those on separately as well as totally separate layers. So if you dropped another spatter on the screen, bring that down here. Again, choose a different solid. Choose a different color this time. Maybe this time it's green, or hideous green, or dark purple, or something like that. Move it underneath, and then use the track mat to do a luma. Basically, treat the luma channel of this spatter as a mat that reveals the purple underneath. Okay, so when you're moving this around, it will be a separate layer. Whoops. Okay, here we go. It'll be a separate layer that can be scaled, moved, rotated, whatever else you want to do to create the background onto which you have your lower third reveal. Okay, so we're kind of out of time. I apologize for. I mean, you have basically 20 minutes or so to experiment with this. If you want, I do encourage you to take it home with you and play with it. It's not a very large file because I trimmed this Dana Woodman video down to like 6 seconds of video. Normally it was like 1.9 gigs. So you're welcome. The idea is that you can copy this onto your USB drives pretty easily. And again, this is my footage. You're free to play with it as you like over the break. But if you want to play with it now, like I said, I'm going to be here for the rest of the class period to answer questions. As long as the questions are not what are the questions on the midterm, I will answer them as best I can. Start with Larita and I'll read.
Not a question on the midterm.